Okay. All right, we're going to go live a little early again. I want a few people show up. So what we'll do is just talk about the new schedule, what's been going on, the old schedule, and what's coming up soon. And we'll just start a little early and we'll talk about that stuff. Hello, testing. Is that better? That's better. All right, let's see if we got the audio working. Need a confirmation. Good. So we'll go live a little bit early and we'll discuss the calendar and what's going on. Bunch of new fun things. So we'll go live a little early before class. In about 15 minutes or so, students will be here and we are going to continue with our year one philosophy of religion course, which accompanies the backbone course for the year one material. And right now we are in, actually, I could probably pull up slides and catch people up to where we are on this. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. Okay, cool. So this is our 7th class so far. There's probably going to be about 30 or 40. This is the philosophy of religion class. It's done in the year one style where we sort of get a slightly more in-depth than the backbone course gives us overview of kind of the battlefields of different regions of philosophy. So in this course, we're going to look at relationships between religion and ethics from a philosophical, analytical point of view. We're going to be looking at arguments for the existence of God, the argument of evil, and arguments against the existence of God, presumptions of atheism, the attributes of the divine, a whole bunch of stuff in different sections that we're going to be looking at. Right now, we're in the first section, which is just the philosophy concerned with the question of religious belief and the potential relationships between a life of reason and a life of faith. So what we've discussed in the first 6 classes is in this section, and we're going to continue it today. We've looked at Thomas Aquinas. Oh, are these the new slides I made? Oh, wait a minute. This is for later. Okay, so we'll go into this in a moment, but let me pull up the original slides here. Okay, what's this? No, that's not it. That's the old version. Let's see. This view? Okay, yes. All right, good. So this is what we went into. So let's take this off, remove that. What a fun show. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions to consider. And in the first section, what we're looking at is the relationship between philosophy and religion. The next section, what we're going to do is look at sort of a meta-religious or a meta-philosophical question about God talk. Is it even possible? Is it possible to have propositional statements that are accurate about something that's infinite? And is all God talk meaningless, or are there different ways of approaching talking about the divine? And then once we're done with that, we'll be looking at the cosmological and ontological and design arguments and things like that. But the first part is this. question of philosophy and religion. So I had posited that there's this two-way conversation that religion helps to develop fields of logic and philosophy. Religious people, they have access to a mode or a method that's different than the philosophical. They have revelation, they have scripture, and then they often try to have systematic theologies, and they try to use the rules of right reason to work out what's true about the divine. But they start with revelation, which is something that typically you're not allowed to do in philosophy, although we've looked at 6 thinkers in philosophy who certainly have a prophetic voice and have sort of one foot in the mythopoetic. And incidentally, their advanced philosophical ideas are depicted in dramatic mythological forms, narrative, and things like that. So there's plenty of different conversations going on, but inside of each of these, right? There's the prophetic and the official inside of religion, the mystical and the doctrinal inside of religion, the dialectic conversations between different traditions. And the same with philosophy, right? There's conversations between the materialistic and the metaphysical, the existential, the analytic, the Platonic and Aristotelian. There's plenty of ways that you could divide it in two and say, okay, this group is talking to that group and having a conversation. But between the two, there's also a conversation going on. So we talked about a relationship between other fields of the humanities and philosophy. But here, okay, so we've got this two-way conversation between philosophy and religion. And again, this is just to sort of talk about some of the things we talked about in the last 6 videos. In about 10 minutes, we will start class when a couple of students arrive, and we'll get started around then. But for now, just to catch you up on what we've been covering, these are the sections we're going to cover: philosophy and religious belief. Right? Is it automatically unreasonable to believe things without good reason? Right? Is that the definition of faith? Is it unethical to allow yourself to believe things for reasons other than having good reasons? We've had Clifford's essay making that point. Is it possible that there is divine truth and that all truth is God's truth, and that if you just use the rules of right reason alone without any revelation, can you come to some or all or some portion of the truths that are also revealed? That was Thomas Aquinas's view. We've read about the presumption of atheism, that the burden of proof is on the religious to give us, one, a coherent view of an idea of God that could be real, and then 2, to argue that he is real. Let's see what else we've read here so far. Actually, we can pull this up. Okay, so we did Aquinas, we did Clifford, we did Anthony Flew. And we did Alvin Plantinga, which I believe we've finished now, although the slide part's not finished. What we did with Plantinga was say, hey, wait a minute, maybe religious belief is properly basic. It's the sort of thing that shouldn't need arguments. Just like, you're not going to argue to the quality of seeing yellow. Just seeing yellowness is a basic ingredient of being able to think in the first place. Then you can look at litmus paper and things like that and go and investigate, but the quality of seeing yellowness is just, you don't have to argue to it, it's just there. And so Plantinga was arguing, and I think that's actually where we left off. It's quite a long essay. In the last 2 videos, I think we've been making progress through that essay, and that's where we're going to continue today. And he hasn't yet given us his full argument for it. He's just given us the trains of thought by his analysis of Thomas Aquinas and where he thinks that foundationalism fails, and the evidentialist criticisms of religious belief and where he thinks they leave open opportunities within the properly basic realm. So we're going to continue with that reading today in about 10 minutes, and our class discussion will be on that. But that's all in this first section, philosophy and religious belief. And then we're going to deal with the problem of God talk. Then we're going to get into arguments for God's existence. Then we're going to look at the attributes of God. So philosophically, the term attributes is used rather than qualities or something because of one of the attributes of God, which is simplicity, which is that we're discussing the sort of entity that doesn't have a north and a south and can't be partitioned into parts. It's just one simple thing. So his justice and his love and his mercy are all the same thing. The same with his wrath or any other aspect of God is really an attribute. It's a thing we attribute to him, but that's because of our limitations. So we'll be looking at some of those questions about his timelessness or power, or are those things incoherent, or do they work philosophically in any way? Then we'll be dealing a while with the problem of evil, and different theogonies and different criticisms of religion. When we did our original 101 in the Backbone course, sort of the intro to all of this, we got to read quite a lot of interesting individuals, including Dostoevsky, on the problem of evil, and it was quite good. Hopefully, we might read that again and add that to what we're already planning on reading. Then we're dealing with questions of morality and religion. Again, all of this is philosophically from the position of using the rules of right reason to sort out our notions and our ideas and what we think. And then we'll be dealing with the immortality of the soul questions. So we have some subsections here. We're going to be dealing with omnipotence and all-knowingness and eternality and simplicity. Simplicity is a very important concept philosophically. And like I said, there's this dialectic between philosophy and theology, and philosophy and religion, and philosophy and mysticism. And as we've been seeing in our Backbone course for year one, all of the major philosophical questions are all intertwined with each other. So there's relevance in the ways that we think about the a priori, for instance. There's relevance when we're considering the thoughts that were developed in medieval theological and philosophy of God, philosophy of religion subjects on the character of God that have something to do with. We're actually going to see this in the knowingness and everything, with questions of predestination, and also questions of free will and determinism and things like that. So all of these are intertwined. They benefit each other. The God that is understood by religious folks has been altered and sophisticated or tweaked or changed in various ways through conversation that comes external to it from philosophy, just as modal logic and all sorts of philosophical developments have come from theologians thinking very seriously about how to make sense of their revealed truth. So there's really a very pleasant back and forth between those two realms. We're only doing philosophy in this course, right? There's other courses where we can look doctrinally or mystically at different religious traditions, or even through them, in the same way that you would sort of adopt the world of the novel and say, okay, well, we can look at the doctrines and the structures. We're not doing any of that here. Or very little of it, and only tangentially when it's appropriate. What we're doing here is a philosophy course, and so we're using the rules of right reason as best we can to clarify and sophisticate our conversations about these things, and to offer, from all points of view, anti-theistic, atheistic, deistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, monotheistic, all of these different perspectives are a part of the conversation whenever anybody from any of them has something to add to some of these subjects. So I'll try to turn that off next time. So we're also going to look at the cosmological, the design, the ontological arguments, which, by the way, are really fantastic material to go through. I'm not saying almost none of year one material has anything to do with what I think about things, but I will say I'm not saying that the ontological arguments work to prove God's existence. What I am saying is they are way more powerful than people think they are. They seem like a kind of a hat trick or a shell game or something when you first hear them. But we looked quite a bit at one or two of them. I think from Anselm, we looked in the intro to the intro, which this is basically the intro course. But in the intro to the intro, we looked at some ontological arguments, and those were quite pleasant classes. I don't think those videos have been uploaded yet, but it's impressive. The ontological arguments are impressive. And we're going to look at God and human experience. We've read some essays in the intro to all of this that had to do with sort of empirical or rationalistic philosophical analysis of the evidence of divine experience. And it's more interesting than it's more impressive evidence than most people tend to think it is, just with the popular views. So these are the essays that we're reading in each of these sections. And right now we're on the fourth one, Religious Belief as Properly Basic by Plantinga. And so in the first 6 classes we've done sort of the intro, and we've done these first 3 essays, and we've spent 2 classes already on this fourth essay, and we're going to be spending at least one more, maybe a few more. It's just a very long essay, but this is, if you're just joining us, the 7th class. We'll be starting it in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. But right now we're in the 4th of these essays, and it's Alvin Plantinga's Religious Belief as Properly Basic, and he's explicitly responding to Thomas Aquinas and Clifford and Anthony Flew, who are the first 3 that we read anyway. So he's discussing all of those and quite a bit more. Actually, Plantinga is really very impressive in a lot of ways. What we saw in the last class is two of the ways that he's extremely impressive. One is his ability to address all of the possible ways of thinking about the questions and at least give them recognition, instead of sort of pretending the conversation is a very simple, it's either A or B, saying, well, other people can think about it this way or this way. Some people have made this argument and this argument. Those don't exactly apply to this. I'm just going to address these over here, and I'm going to address it in this way. And it's encyclopedic what he understands about all of the ways that people can think about these things. And yet he's not dodging discussing any of those other ways, because he's only bringing it up for the specific reason of demonstrating the development of his thought on this idea that he's hoping to prove in his essay, that religious belief is the sort of thing that doesn't need to be argued to. So this first section is about faith and reason, basically, before we get started in more of the meat of these things. And in any event, we're going to be continuing reading that today. And like I said, we'll be started in just a few minutes, but this is what the rest of the course looks like. These are the individuals that we'll be reading. And we're probably going to start in about 5 or 10 minutes. Let me get rid of these slides because we don't need them any longer. Let me turn my phone off so that we don't get any more interruptions. Okay, no more noises from phones. Okay, so without further ado, we will get started right where we left off with this really interesting essay by Plantinga. Welcome, we're already live, Savad. I know you remember where we left off, but I was just started a little early and caught anybody up who wanted to get caught up. So now we're in part 2. We're in part 2 of this very long and quite interesting essay by Plantinga, which is encyclopedic in his consideration of ways of thinking, but is also just leading us up to so far where his argument's going to go. So we remember they said three streams of thought got him to this idea of his that perhaps religious belief is properly basic. It's not unreasonable to have religious beliefs if they're in a certain context. And he's hinted at some of that context. Not being able to help to believe isn't good enough. He's actually quite good at arguing against himself, which is the other very impressive thing, which is he's sort of having the dialectic conversation within his head through this essay. But he's looked so far in this first part that we just finished at the evidentialist objections to religious belief. It's unreasonable, it's unethical to believe in unreasonable things. Reason demands that you presume atheism until you're convinced. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. He's looked at all sorts of different camps of philosophical perspective that say, hey, now hold on a second, we're here to be reasonable if we're philosophers, and we've got some objections to the idea that faith by definition is absolving you from the reason requirement. And he says, well, let's see if that's the case. So what we've mostly been left with from that first thread is that there is such a thing as a properly basic belief, that even with the arguments that he was looking at, the evidentialist arguments, it boiled down to, logically, he thinks, something like you shouldn't adopt a belief unless it fits in reasonably with your other beliefs that you have good reasons to believe. And there's a network of beliefs, and it would be unreasonable to have contradictions and things like that. He says, but now hold on a second, wait a minute, where do those other beliefs come from? Why can't religion be one of the starting beliefs that you just sort of have? And he didn't see an argument against that. It's almost like it hadn't explicitly occurred to anyone, although I think he thinks that Reformed theology implicitly has this idea, and he's hoping to make it more explicit in this essay. So the second thread of thought that got him to this idea was his analysis of the arguments for God's existence and the positive theophilosophical ideas of Aquinas, the foundationalism, right? So he's doing philosophical reasoning argument to get to the same truths that agree with revelation, and saying, I won't be surprised if that's the case, and then getting there. And he felt like there was a problem with that. So that's what the second part's about, and that's what we're going to start right now. I trust you to send me a message if the microphone isn't working again like it wasn't 2 days ago, but I assume it is. Okay. Part 2, Aquinas and foundationalism. In this section, I shall give what I take to be the evidentialist objector's answer to these questions. I shall argue that his answer is not in the least compelling, and that the prospects for his project are not bright. But it is not only evidentialist objectors that have thought theists need evidence if their belief is to be rational, right? If he's going to be arguing that you don't need reasons, what's he going to do with Thomas Aquinas and all his really good reasons? And we're going to spend a lot of time on Thomas Aquinas as one of the courses we do in year 2 that complement the backbone course, which is very different in style than reading these essays like this. It's a chronological narrative version of the whole history of philosophy. But we stop and spend more time on certain thinkers. And we're going to be looking at Aquinas, and Dr. Tartaglia is coming soon. We're working extra long on Monday to get the rest of his Gödel class together, but that will be available soon. It's going to be pretty exciting. But one day he and I were having a conversation, and the question of, what's the progress of philosophy? Do we know more than people in the back knew? Do we, in the back of time, knew, and all of this? And I said, to me, that the lens that's more helpful is the one that says they're all talking to each other over time, and they kind of have access to all the same ideas. And sometimes philosophy instructors don't think that. So I said, look, let's go to the 12th century. And I swear this was a fun experiment we did. I just pulled up Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, and we read, I think, one, maybe two of the, he's very methodical the way he does it. I think we only read one section. And in that section, it was mind-blowing. I knew there was impressive stuff in there, which is why I picked one of these sections, but I hadn't read it in a long time. In that section, one sentence right after another, he outlines a priori synthetic thinking, all of the stuff that, we think of. Kant gave us the terminology that we use for it today. And he was absolutely describing these characteristics of types of knowledge that we might have access to and criticizing them. And we stopped, and I think both of us were a little bit blown away by how good the demonstration worked out. I had this vague idea, like, I think Aquinas can help us here. I was thinking we'd find like germs of Mill and Kant's ethics, deontology and other considerations, which I'm sure are in there as well. But we hit on that one, and it was just like, it's game over. I think we've both been pretty convinced since then. All right, so why did I bring all that up? Because we'll be looking at Aquinas, and it's really worth doing in our second year material. But here he is, making a whole bunch of arguments for God's existence. Like Ghazali, he's theological and he's religious and he believes in revelation, and he argues philosophically that it makes sense that revelation would be a thing. He doesn't rely on revelation to make any of his arguments. He says, no, let's put on the philosopher's cap. Let's just use reason. Oh, look at this. It turns out that just using reason leads you to the understanding of everything that's Orthodox theology. It's more impressive than you think it is. If you think that must be silly and roll your eyes, it's much more impressive than you think, However, this will be a problem for Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga is going to say the nature of religious belief is that it's properly basic. In other words, not only would it be inappropriate to demand arguments and reason to believe in it, not only would arguments and reason be unuseful because it's more like just sewn into you or appropriate or not unreasonable to, and we'll see how he gets there. He hasn't gotten there yet, but we've hinted at ideas like, okay, can you use reason to know who you should marry? It's like, well, if you decide to do that, you'll never have enough reasons and then you'll die at the age of 80 single. You kind of have to pull the trigger. And religious belief of relationship with the divine could be like that. But he even separates, Plantinga's already separated that from just affirming the proposition that God exists, something simpler than a relational aspect of it. And he's going to try to argue that even affirming that and assenting to it would be properly basic. And now the problem is, not only would it be superfluous to requirements and inappropriate to demand, but it might be wrong in some way. If you had a really good argument for God's existence, there should be something wrong with it, or relying on it might be wrong if it's properly basic. That, like, there might be some tension between Plantinga and a guy like Aquinas, who's going to give us these arguments for God's existence. So let's see what he says here. In particular, many Christian thinkers in the tradition of natural theology have thought so. Thomas Aquinas, of course, is the natural theologian par excellence. Thomist thought is also, as it seems to me, the natural starting point for philosophical reflection on these topics, Protestant as well as Catholic. So, for those of you who don't know, and probably you do, Thomas Aquinas is like major jewel in the Catholic Church. The Catholics are like, oh, you've got a lot of philosophy? Well, let us introduce you to this fellow because he's a pretty impressive philosopher, and you haven't dealt with him fully yet, I'm sure. What Plantinga is doing is saying he seems to be coming from a Reformed theological perspective, and he's even said he's trying to make this properly basic idea explicit, where he thinks it was implicit with the work of the Protestants. But before he starts talking about Aquinas, he says, look, you're not a good Protestant. You're not an educated, literate, theologically serious Protestant unless you know about Thomas Aquinas too, right? So he's tipping the hat and giving a salute and saying, hey, the Catholics kind of have the big chief guy over here. Let's start with that and let's see what we can make out of it. So that's what he's doing here. All right, no doubt there are mountains between Rome and Geneva. Nevertheless, Protestants should, in these matters, be what Ralph McInerney calls peeping Thomas. At any rate, they should begin as peeping Thomas. We must therefore look at some of Aquinas' views on these matters. So I don't know if he feels the need to apologize to his possibly predominantly Protestant audience. He shouldn't feel that way. I think pretty much everybody recognizes Aquinas. Well, it sounds more like he's saying, hey, if you like theology and you're a bunch of Protestants, maybe go get intellectually really serious, and this might be a good place to start. And look, it's even outside our house. In any event, he underlines all that. All right. Part A, Aquinas and evidentialism. Right? It's still an evidentialism, right? The first one was evidentialist challenges to fideism, to faith. But now, what about evidentialist affirmations? I've got evidence. Here is the proof that God exists. And some of them are quite impressive, as we will see. Yeah, that's probably true. But so do ideologists of all sorts. I think I don't know if I'm going to do this, but maybe I will. We'll just let people's comments show up on screen for a moment. In any event, all right, part 1 of part A of part 2, Aquinas on knowledge. According to Aquinas, it is possible for us to have scientific knowledge, scientia, of the existence and immateriality, unity, simplicity, and perfection of God. Okay, we haven't done the Summa Theologica yet, but we said he's going to use reason to prove some of the theological revealed truths. It turns out, according to this summation, that he can prove not only God's existence without using the Bible or Revelation, but the fact that he's immaterial, he's a singular unity, that he's simple, which we're going to learn a lot about what that means in one section. But simplicity, we've talked a little bit about it before, and perfect. He thinks he can get there without the Bible. As Aquinas sees it, scientia is knowledge that is inferred from what is seen to be true. Quote, any science is possessed by virtue of principles known immediately and therefore seen. Whatever, then, is an object of science is in some sense seen. He's talking about demonstrations, deductive arguments, proofs. The difference between an inferential argument, a percentage argument, a likelihood argument, and a deductive argument is a proof is supposed to sort of force you to believe something. Once you see the moves and assent to the premises, you're sort of forced to believe the conclusion. There's a strong positive evidentialism in all of this language. And Plantinga, I don't think, is very comfortable with it, but let's see what he has to say about it. But the idea is like, no, I could prove if you are honest and you have a brain and you would like to look at the evidence and you look at it, you will just come, oh, I can't help but believe in God now. It couldn't be any other way. Those are the types of arguments that he was putting forward. All right, Plantinga continues. Aristotle suggests that the principles of a science must be self-evident, and Aquinas sometimes seems to follow him in holding that scientia, properly speaking, consists in a body of propositions deduced syllogistically from self-evident first principles. Or perhaps scientia consists not just in those syllogistic conclusions, but in the syllogisms themselves as well. Logic and mathematics seem to be the best examples of science so thought of. Consider, for example, propositional logic. Here, one can start from self-evident axioms and proceed to deduce theorems by argument forms, modus ponens, for example, that are themselves self-evidently valid in an obvious sense. We will look more at logical arguments at some point, but we did look at modus ponens in our intro to determinism and free will. Right in the intro part, we had seen some of those structures. Okay. Other good examples of science so thought of would be first-order logic and arithmetic. And here, it would be the theorems, not the axioms, of these systems that would constitute science. Scientia is mediate knowledge, so that one does not have scientia of what is self-evident. Strictly speaking, then, only those arithmetical truths that are not self-evident would constitute science. The proposition 3 + 1 = 4 is unlikely to appear as an axiom in a formulation of arithmetic, since it is self-evident. However, it does not constitute scientia, even if it appears as a theorem in some axiomatization of arithmetic. We won't make commentary on this. We've been talking about in our a priori class on Tuesdays a lot of this. All right, if this is relevant, we're going to put it up here. I don't know if it's relevant, so maybe we won't put all these comments up here. The English meaning of the word faith is strong belief in the doctrines of the witness. All right, we're going to stop putting those up just because they're not exactly relevant to this essay, although those perspectives that you're expressing are relevant to the course, and we will be reading essays by people who are making those cases. Okay. Of course, the first principles of a science, the axioms, as opposed to, I mean, you recognize all this language from our a priori class, the first principles of a science, the axioms, all of this stuff Kant was talking about. This is all, he's using that framework to analyze all this. The axioms, as opposed to the theorems, so to say, are also known. They are known immediately rather than mediately, and are known by understanding. Quote, now a truth can come into the mind in two ways, namely, as known in itself and as known through another. What is known in itself is like a principle, and this is in the 12th century. This is Aquinas. We just spent a lot of time bashing our heads up against Kant, who probably took pages to say what this paragraph's going to say here. But you be the judge. I don't know how I have a hair in my mouth. Sorry, it's distracting. All right, this is Aquinas. Now, a truth can come into the mind in two ways, namely, as known in itself and as known through another. What is known in itself is like a principle and is perceived immediately by the mind. And so the habit which perfects the intellect is considering such a truth. In considering such a truth is called understanding. It is a firm and easy quality of mind which sees into principles. This is so much like Kant. What is this? A truth, however, which is known through another is understood by the intellect, not immediately, but through an inquiry of reason, of which it is the terminus. Yeah, that's from the Summa Theologica. It's almost like Kant was plagiarizing certain things. I'm not saying that for real, but you get it. I mean, that's when we said Aquinas was impressive, I didn't know we'd have quotes to back it up here, but it's exactly what I was talking about before. Okay. Like many of Aquinas' distinctions, and of course everybody agrees the ancient Greeks are relevant, but the medievals are more relevant than people think. All right. Like many of Aquinas' distinctions, they may be ahead of us, by the way. This one comes from, oh, good, Mark made it. Nice to see you, buddy. Like many of Aquinas' distinctions, this one comes from Aristotle. Now, we're going to talk a lot about this in year 2, but really quickly, we'll just mention the scholastics, the medieval scholastics, basically worshipped Aristotle. And one of the things that they said about doing in philosophy was making distinctions. Oh, there's one type, there's two types, there's 4 types of cause. This type has 2 different types, right? They're just dissecting every idea and making distinctions. And it's quite useful and it's a lot of fun, but that's what they were all about. When Thomas Aquinas quotes Aristotle, he'll often quote just quotations from ancient Greeks or the Bible or something, not to build his argument off of it, but to suggest, hey, I'm not the first guy to think of this in the structure of how he attacks each question. And whenever he quotes Aristotle, he just calls him the philosopher. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what the scholastics appreciated about Aristotle. But Aquinas is quite interesting because there's also Neoplatonists. There's still this conversation between the Aristotelian worshippers and the Platonists. And Aquinas isn't so easily categorized as one or the other. There's an awful lot of what he's saying that's absolutely Platonic. So we'll see that in due time. Anyway, like many of Aquinas' distinctions, this one comes from Aristotle. So now we're going to read Aristotle. Now, of the thinking states by which we grasp truth, some are unfailingly true, others admit of error, opinion, for example, and calculation, whereas scientific knowledge and intuition are always true. Further, no other kind of thought except intuition is more accurate than scientific knowledge, whereas primary premises are more knowable than demonstrations, and all scientific knowledge is discursive. From these considerations, it follows that there will be no scientific knowledge of the primary premises. Oh, that's what he's been talking about. And since, except intuition, nothing can be truer than scientific knowledge, it will be intuition that apprehends the primary premises. Let's look at this quote by Aristotle for a moment. We might look back at Aquinas saying much the same distinction there. This is a foundationalism, right? He's saying, okay, there's things you don't have to argue to. There's things you can't argue to. You use them to argue to other things. The faculty of the mind that allows you to apprehend them is being translated here as intuition. But then you use logic and deductive reasoning to get to the other ones. Following Aristotle, then, Aquinas distinguishes what is self-evident or known through itself, per se nota, from what is known through another, per aliud nota. The former are principles and are apprehended by understanding, while the latter constitute science. Science as knowledge, right? We see how they're defining it here. Okay. Aquinas' central point here is that self-evident propositions are known immediately. Consider a proposition like 2 + 2 = 3. Contrast it with one like 281 times 29 = 8,149. We know the first, but not the second immediately. We know it, and we do not know it by way of inference from other propositions or on the basis of our knowledge of other propositions. Instead, we simply see that it is true. Whereas Aquinas says that a proposition that is self-evident to us, per se notum quod nos, is such that we cannot grasp or apprehend it without believing, indeed knowing it. Okay, so this is through intuition, right? And elsewhere, Aquinas says, look, you can't help but have these intuitions. They're sort of written into you here. They make the other thinking possible. On the other hand, it is such that we cannot grasp without indeed knowing it. On the other hand, does not have this status for us. Few of us can simply see that it is true. The other one, all right. No, oh, I see. Number 2, on the other hand, the 281 times 29. Instead, for that, we must resort to calculation. We go through a chain of inferences, the ultimate premises of which are self-evident. Right? So all that other scientia, all that other knowledge you can get to, you get to it through the use of logic from starting points that are known to you in a different way. Okay, so Aquinas and Aristotle are both positing that distinction and that frame for understanding how we come to know things. Okay, of course, self-evident propositions are known, even though they do not constitute scientia in the strict sense. Indeed, their epistemic status, according to Aquinas, is higher than that of propositions known by demonstration. The same was true with Aristotle, too, from that quote we read. More exactly, our epistemic condition in grasping a truth of this sort is superior to the condition we are in with respect to a proposition of which we have knowledge by demonstration. The emerging picture of scientific knowledge, then, is the one to be found in Aristotle's posterior analytics. We know what is self-evident and what follows from what is self-evident by self-evident argument forms. Once we're done with the core curriculum, I do plan on going back to year 1 and having Aristotelian logic as one of the things. It's really fun and worth studying. He identified logical forms that were valid, that worked, and then as long as you're plugging in these self-evident premises, you'll get to true conclusions that have to follow. It's good stuff. Okay. Knowledge consists of scientia and intellectus, or understanding. By understanding, we grasp first principles. So understanding, or as Aristotle was translated, intuition, gives us first principles, self-evident truths. From these, we infer or deduce further truths. What we know consists in what we find self-evident together with what we can infer from it by logical means. And if we take this picture seriously, it looks as if knowledge is restricted to what is necessarily true in the broadly logical sense. Presumably, a proposition is per se nota, only if it is necessarily true. And any proposition that follows from necessary truths by self-evident argument forms will itself be necessarily true. As Aristotle puts it, quote, since the object of pure scientific knowledge cannot be other than it is, the truth obtained by demonstrative knowledge will be necessary. All right, we're starting with things that have to be true. We're doing the a priori section right now on Tuesdays. We're starting with things like that, and then we're using correct logical forms to get to things that are almost as necessarily true, that are there. Like if they necessarily follow from necessary truths, they are as necessary. We're not as sure because there's room for error along the way, but we're starting with things that have to be true. And if we're using logic properly, this is pretty solid knowledge we think we have. We can imagine how Plantinga is going to have trouble with that, right? But this is the perspective. Okay. As a picture of Aquinas' view of science, however, this is at best incomplete, for Aquinas obviously believes we have knowledge, scientific knowledge, of much that is not logically necessary. He thinks there is such a thing as natural science, scientia naturalis, whose subject matter is changeable material objects. Quote, on the other hand, there is the fact that demonstrative knowledge, scientia, is found in the intellect. Had the intellect no knowledge of material things, it could not have demonstrative knowledge of them. Thus, there would be no natural science dealing with changeable material beings. Interesting. And then there's the fact that demonstrative knowledge is found in the intellect. Had the intellect no knowledge of material things, it would not have demonstrable knowledge of them. Thus, there would be no natural science. Okay, good. All right, Aquinas means to say, furthermore, not merely that in natural science we know some necessary truths about contingent and changeable objects, as we do in knowing, for example, that whatever is moved by another. He means that among the truths we know are such contingent propositions as that there is a tree outside the window and that its branches are moving in the wind. There are two sorts of propositions whose truth we simply see. First, there are those that are self-evident or per se nota. These are the object of intellectus or understanding, and we see their truth in the way that we see 1 + 2 make 3. Second, there are propositions evident to the senses. As he puts it, quote, that some things move is evident to the senses, as is the proposition that the sun moves. His examples of propositions evident to the senses are, for the most part, propositions whose truth we determine by sight. All right, so two ways that things can be self-evident. Although, of course, Aquinas did not think of vision as the only sense-yielding knowledge, he did give it pride of place, because it is immaterial, he says. It is more of a knower than the other senses. It is not easy to see just what Aquinas means by evident to the senses, but perhaps the following is fairly close. A proposition is evident to the senses if we human beings have the power to determine its truth by looking at, listening to, tasting, touching, or smelling some physical object. Thus, proposition 3, there is a tree outside my window, and proposition 4, the cat on the mat is fuscus, and proposition 5, this wall is yellow, are propositions evident to the senses. You would know if they were true or false just by looking. So, but that's different than the first way that things are self-evident, which is it's not possible logically to even conceive of them not being that way, right? Kant gave us so many good examples, right? What was the one that we focused on so much in our Tuesday class the other day with Kant? Contingent beings. Oh, shoot. I can't remember what it was. There's so many. My dog kept me up last night. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to think of one right now, I don't think. Well, he gave one a second ago. He said that objects which move are moved by other objects. That certainly wasn't what we covered with Kant, but that would be the type of idea if it's constructed properly. Okay. In the first place, then, there are those propositions we simply see to be true. In the second place, there are those propositions we see to follow from those in the first group. These propositions can be deduced from those in the first group by arguments we see to be valid. So the basic picture of knowledge is this. We know what we see to be true together with what we can infer from what we see to be true by arguments we can see to be valid. Fair enough. Part 2, Aquinas on knowledge of God. Now, Aquinas believes that human beings, even in our earthly condition here below, can have knowledge, scientific knowledge of God's existence, as well as knowledge that he has such attributes as simplicity, eternity, immateriality, immutability, and the like. In Summa Theologia, Aquinas sets out his famous 5 ways or 5 proofs of God's existence. In Summa Contra Gentiles, he sets out the proof from motion in much greater detail. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. And in each case, he follows these alleged demonstrations that God possesses the attributes just mentioned. So, natural knowledge of God is possible. But the vast majority of those who believe in God, he thinks, do not have knowledge of God's existence, but must instead take it on faith. Only a few of us have the time, inclination, and ability to follow the theistic proofs. The rest of us take this truth on faith. And even though God's existence is demonstrable, even though we are capable of knowing it, nevertheless, it is appropriately proposed to human beings as an object of faith. The reason, in brief, is that our welfare demands that we believe the proposition in question, but knowledge of it is exceedingly hard to come by. Quote, for the rational truth about God would have appeared to only a few, and even so, after a long time and mixed with many errors, whereas on knowing this depends our whole welfare, which is in God. From all this, it is clear that if it were necessary to use a strict demonstration as the only way to reach a knowledge of the things we must know about God, very few could ever construct such a demonstration, and even these could do it only after a long time. From this, it is evident that the provision of the way of faith, which gives all easy access to salvation at any time, is beneficial to man. That was a part of his argument regarding theology and revelation and philosophy, and which, are they both appropriate, and should they both appreciate each other, and that type of thing at the beginning of the Summa. Okay. Alvin continues now. So most of those who believe in God do so on faith. Fundamentally, for Aquinas, to accept a proposition on faith is to accept it on God's authority. Faith is a matter of believing God. For that which is above reason, we believe only because God has revealed it, unquote. Now, so he also said that, right? You can get to some truths with reason, but there are others that you're just going to have to, everyone's going to have to take, because there just isn't a logical proof for it. Okay. Now, what about those who believe in God on faith, even though they do not know that God exists? How can that be a rational procedure? So far, as I know, Aquinas does not explicitly address this question. He does discuss a closely related question, however, the question whether those who believe take on faith what is above reason are irrational or foolish, or in his terms, believe with undue levity. All right, so let's see what he has to say about that. Is this the quote? Okay, here it comes. All right. So Alvin isn't aware of Thomas Aquinas saying, well, okay, if you can prove something, shouldn't everybody learn it? No, you can't. Okay. Is it irrational for them to believe? Is their faith irrational, even though they should have it? And it's a good thing that they can have it. So I don't know if he addresses that, but he does argue that there are truths about God that have to be revealed to all of us. It doesn't matter how clever you are. The evidence isn't there for you to know that it's true, except you know that God's real, and you can understand his word is real and that type of thing. He's not going to do that to make his philosophical arguments, but he's going to make philosophical arguments about that for the theologians and say, hey, yeah, what you're doing is a science. It's a thing to do. But he's going to say, but there's certain things that you might be able to know that we can't know just by reason alone. And so let's see if that is irrational, right? That's Alvin Plantinga's whole question is, would it be irrational to believe it even if you believe it because God told you and you believe he's God and you have good reason to believe he's God or something like that? Is it still irrational to believe something that you can't actually know? Here's what Aquinas says. Those who place their faith in this truth, however, for which the human reason offers no experimental evidence, do not believe foolishly, as though following artificial fables. For these secrets of divine wisdom, the divine wisdom itself, which knows all things to the full, has deemed to reveal to men. It reveals its own presence, as well as the truth of its teaching and inspiration by fitting arguments. And in order to confirm those truths that exceed natural knowledge, it gives visible manifestations to works that surpass the ability of all nature. Thus, there are the wonderful cures of illnesses. There is the raising of the dead and the wonderful immutation in the heavenly bodies. And what is more wonderful, there is the inspiration given to human minds, so that simple and untutored persons filled with the gift of the Holy Spirit come to possess instantaneously the highest wisdom and the readiest eloquence. When these arguments were examined through the efficacy of the above mentioned proof, Aquinas continues, and not the violent assault of arms or the promise of pleasures, and what is most wonderful of all, in the midst of the tyranny of the persecutors, an innumerable throng of people, both simple and most learned, flock to the Christian faith. In this faith, there are truths preached that surpass every human intellect. The pleasures of the flesh are curbed. It is taught that the things of the world should be spurned. Now, for the minds of mortal men to assent to these things is the greatest of miracles, just as it is a manifest work of divine inspiration that, spurning visible things, men should seek only what is invisible. Now that this has happened neither without preparation nor by chance, but as a result of the disposition of God, is clear from the fact that through many pronouncements of the ancient prophets, God had foretold that he would do this. The books of these prophets are held in veneration among us Christians, since they give witness to our faith. Here's the point, says Plantinga. I think it's this. It is, of course, totally proper and entirely sensible to take a belief on God's say-so. That would be reasonable. To accept it on his authority. Clearly, I am not foolish or irrational in believing something on the authority of my favorite mathematician, even if I cannot work it out for myself. I may thus come to believe, for example, that the four-color problem has been solved. But then, a fortiori, I would not be foolish or irrational in accepting a belief on the basis of God's authority. If I know that God promises P to me for belief, then clearly enough, it is eminently sensible to believe P. The question is not whether it is foolish to believe something on God's authority, but whether it is foolish to believe that God has in fact proposed a given item for my belief. Obviously, if he has, then I should believe it. But what is my reason or motive for supposing that in fact it is God who has proposed for our belief, for example, the teaching of the Trinity? This is the question Aquinas addresses in the above passage. He means to argue that it is not foolish or irrational to take it that God has proposed for our belief just those items Christians suppose that he has, the articles of faith. What he means to say, I think, is that to believe in the mysteries of the faith is not to be foolish or to believe with undue levity, because we have evidence for the conclusion that God has proposed them for our belief. This is exactly what he was up to in that quote that we just read. All right. So let's look at what Aquinas is doing here. He's saying, look, imagine that the God of all creation told me that there was a teapot orbiting Mars. We'll use that example from another context. A teapot orbiting Mars. How irrational would it be to believe in a teapot orbiting Mars? That's pretty irrational. So what makes it not irrational to believe it on God's authority? For Aquinas, the answer is, well, not just because, hey, I believe it because God said so and I decided whatever he tells me is true. Rather, because there are good reasons for believing that this is the real God and that he really did say this. That's what hinges. That's what the whole question of is it rational for me to believe it hinges upon. So for Aquinas, you still need, so when he mentions all of the testimony of learned and ignorant people who came and witnessed these miracles that happened where people would give up all earthly, human, normal, present moment hedonistic desires and follow the invisible, and that's a pretty great miracle. And here they're doing it at the preachments of this thing. And so how do we know that this happened? Because lots of historians can look at all of the people who said, yeah, I didn't believe in that, but yeah, that definitely happened. All these people started believing in this religion in this context, and this is the way they behaved. And you say, oh, what are we looking at? We're looking at historical evidence. We don't even have to agree with the religion itself. What we're doing is we're using rules of reason and evidence to support, hey, these people over here seem to be they seem to have some miracles accompanying their irrational beliefs, and there's a lot of reason, or their beliefs that are beyond reason, and they've got a lot of reasons to believe in the God that's talking to them. So if you've got those parts together, it's not unreasonable or irrational. But you see, you have to have those parts from the excuse or the argument that Aquinas is making here. We'll see what Plantinga thinks about this at some point. All right, this is the question Aquinas stresses in the above passage. He means to argue evidence for the conclusion that God has proposed in this. This evidence consists in the fulfillment of prophecy and in the signs and wonders accompanying the proclamation of these mysteries. Aquinas refers here to works that surpass the ability of all nature, such as wonderful cures of illness, the raising of the dead, and the like. The greatest miracle of all, he says, is the marvelous rapidity with which the Christian faith has spread, despite the best efforts of tyrants, and despite the fact that, quote, in this faith there are truths preached that surpass every human intellect. The pleasures of the flesh are curbed. It is taught that the things of the world should be spurned. He thinks that's the greatest miracle, is that a whole bunch of people said, yeah, that sounds right to me. No more doing things that make me feel good. I should be about something else. Like, what the heck made that possible? And again, he's looking at the fact that people did that and that there is evidence that it happened. Okay. I think he means to suggest furthermore that if we did not have this evidence or some other evidence, we would be foolish or irrational in accepting the mysteries of the faith. Right? So imagine this hypothetical other world for Aquinas. Imagine he's imagining it. Say, look, I can use my reason to get to the idea that God exists. I can use my reason to figure out, oh, he must be perfect. I can use my reason to figure out 4 other attributes about him that must be true, eternal and all-knowing and all of this. I just reason, no Bible, no a priest told me that it happened a long time ago, no revelation at all. I can just use reason and get there, and we're going to examine all that later. But the religious believe all sorts of things that are beyond reason. So what Aquinas could have done is say, well, I'll be a deist. I'll just believe the things I can know for reasons, and then you religious people can talk about stuff beyond reason. But he didn't do that. Instead, he used reason to say, now, hold on a second. There's all sorts of other things these theologians are saying. I've discovered that a lot of what they said is definitely true. But there's other things that I couldn't know if it was true or not because it's beyond reason for me to understand it. So what would make it reasonable for me to accept such a thing? Well, are the things which are beyond reason being taught and accompanied by things which are beyond nature, miracles? It would be reasonable for a God to say, look, forget the rules of evidence and reason. Forget how science works. Here's a miracle to let you know, hey, something else is going on here. It's beyond what you could ever understand, but pay attention. Okay, there's some evidence. What about, and he looks at historical evidence and other things. He says, okay, I could use reason and evidence to say this religion is onto something. And, imagine you had arguments that said the Bible is the word of God. Well, if you've got reasonable arguments that prove that apart from appeals to the Bible, what's unreasonable about believing what you read in the Bible at that point? That's basically the Thomistic position on the propositions of faith that are beyond reason. Okay. It is just because we have evidence for these things that we are not irrational in accepting them. Here, by way of contrast, he cites the followers of Muhammad, who he says do not have evidence. It is thus clear that those who place any faith in his words believe foolishly, says Thomas Aquinas. What is important to see here is the following. Aquinas clearly believes that there are some propositions we are rationally justified in accepting. The proposition can be supported by reason. No, I'm sorry. The proposition, which can't be supported by reason, you still can be reasonable in accepting, even though we do not have evidence for them, right? So that should have finished the sentence first. Aquinas clearly believes that there are some propositions we are rationally justified. In other words, nobody gets to point a finger at us and say, you're irrational. No, it's rational for me to accept this proposition, even if I don't have reasons for it. Evidence for them or reasons for them from other propositions, or accept them on the basis of other propositions. Let us say that a proposition is basic for me if I believe it and do not believe it on the basis of other propositions. This relationship is familiar but hard to characterize in a revealing and non-trivial fashion. I believe the word umbrageous is spelled umbrageous. This belief is based on another belief of mine, the belief that is how the dictionary says it is spelled. I believe that 72 times 71 is 5,112. This belief is based on several other beliefs I hold. For instance, that 1 times 72 equals 72, and 7 times 2 equals 14, and 7 times 7 is 49, and 49 plus 1 is 50, and others. Some of my beliefs, however, I accept, but do not accept on the basis of any other beliefs. Call these beliefs basic. I believe that 2 plus 1 equals 3, for example, and do not believe it on the basis of other propositions. I also believe that I am seated at my desk and that there is a mild pain in my right knee. These two are basic for me. I do not believe them on the basis of others, these also. Now, the propositions we are rationally justified in accepting as basic, thinks Aquinas, are the ones we see to be true, those that are self-evident or evident to the senses. As for the rest of the propositions we believe, we are rational in accepting them only if they stand in a certain relationship to those that are properly basic. Among the non-basic propositions we rationally accept, some we see to follow from those that are basic. These are the propositions we know. Others are not known to us, do not follow from basic propositions, but are nonetheless rationally acceptable. So this is the last category. Others are not known to us, do not follow from basic propositions, but are nonetheless rationally acceptable because they are probable or likely with respect to them. I believe Aquinas means to hold more generally that a proposition is rationally acceptable for us only if it is at least probable with respect to beliefs that are properly basic for us. I'm not sure that's a fair reading of Aquinas. We'll have to take a look. That is, with respect to beliefs that are self-evident or evident to the senses. And hence, on this view, as on the evidentialist objectors, belief in God is rational for us only if we have evidence for it. I think that I'll concur with that analysis because of the last sentence. And when I'm not so tired, I'll go back and look at that penultimate sentence, which I think might not have been completely fair or accurate. Okay, but his conclusion is Aquinas, like the evidentialist critics of faith, think that you need to have evidence that underpins what you believe religiously. Of course, Aquinas doesn't think you actually have to have those reasons, right? People can believe it because they have faith. But we would be, if we want to be philosophical, irrational to believe in something like the Trinity unless we could argue to it from first principles, or this is the other category for Aquinas, if we could argue from first principles the truth of the message about the Trinity and the source and the fact that it was accurately transmitted to us, okay, then it's still reasonable. But Plantinga doesn't think so. Plantinga thinks the real category you should be putting belief in God in is in the properly basic category, not in the I need evidence for it category. And you see that he hasn't gotten to the argument for that yet, but we know that that's where he's going to go because he, like a good writer, told us a thesis at the beginning. So we know he's going to try to argue that. But that's devastating to Aquinas' entire perspective here and his project. Okay, part B of the Aquinas section, foundationalism. Aquinas and the evidentialist objector concur then in holding that belief in God is rationally acceptable only if there is evidence for it. Only if, that is, it is probable with respect to some body of propositions that constitutes the evidence. And here we can get a better understanding of Aquinas and the evidentialist objector if we see them as accepting some version of classical foundationalism. This is a picture or total way of looking at faith, knowledge, justified belief, rationality, and allied topics. This picture has been enormously popular in Western thought, and despite a substantial opposing groundswell, I think it remains the dominant way of thinking about these topics. I think he's still correct about that. When Dr. Tartaglia comes and gives us the Gödel class, it's going to be amazing. But much more amazing than that class is his class on Quine. And I've been talking with him a lot lately and helping get everything ready, the technology and all that for this. But I want to share with you a little bit about what's coming on that, and it'll be relevant to where Plantinga is going. We've seen the blowout, the kicking of the shins, the falling down and the collapse of these Vienna Circle logical positivists. But the story doesn't end there. Guys like Quine and those who came after him were picking up the broken pieces, not maybe making certain fatal errors that they made, and trying to carry on that side of the conversation further. When the Nietzschean prophesied nihilistic postmodernists came in and just turned everything to shit. Every department has become garbage in academia in the West. I have met literature professors, heads of departments whose entire career is to convince students that reading books is pointless because you can never translate the meaning from one brain to another. The literature department head spends his life arguing that he shouldn't be the head of a department and the department shouldn't exist. Everything was just sort of frozen by this nihilistic insanity. What's exciting about the class that Tartaglia is going to be bringing to us, hopefully soon, is that it picks up the pieces of that conversation and says, let's just go find where everything left off and try to continue this side. And it's a really great complement to the alternative third-year course, the one that I've been providing, which is the Nietzsche existentialism one, where we decode Zarathustra as the core. So the two voices that need to be talking to each other, you could pick which one you're more interested in at that point by the time you get to the third-year material. I know mostly what we're doing here is year one stuff, but that's all coming soon. It's going to be pretty exciting. Why we bring that up is that as he's been talking with me about Quine, we have seen in one of our slides in the other class on the a priori, Quine is not a foundationalist. He's not using this idea that we talked about earlier, that there are basic things that are just the grounding truths that you just know self-evidently, and then you use good logical forms to argue and build a whole castle on that ground. Instead, he sees, imagine in zero gravity space, a whole bunch of nodes, and all your beliefs are nodes that are tied together with strings, and some are core in that they're tied, like almost every belief requires that you believe them, right? How many of your beliefs, like vanilla is better than chocolate, require the belief that matter exists? Okay, matter exists is really core. You're not going to take that one out and replace it with something else without upheavaling the entire lattice work of beliefs. But a fringe belief, that could easily be replaced, right? And so there's still a hierarchy of more and less valuable and relied upon propositions, but without the foundationalism, without the idea that this is all built on something solid, that if that cracks, the whole thing is gone. So when Plantinga says classical foundationalism is the dominant picture even today, even though there are other alternatives that are building up momentum, this is, he thinks, pretty much predominant. And I think he wrote this a decade or two ago at least. I think that statement's still correct. So let's look at classical foundationalism. This is a picture or total way of looking at faith, knowledge, justified belief, rationality, and allied topics. This picture has been enormously popular in Western thought, and despite a substantial opposing groundswell, I think it remains the dominant way of thinking about these topics. According to the foundationalist, some propositions are properly basic and some are not. Those that are not are rationally accepted only on the basis of evidence. There, where the evidence must trace back ultimately to what is properly basic. The existence of God, furthermore, is not among the propositions that are properly basic. Hence, a person is rational in accepting theistic belief only if he has evidence for it. The vast majority of those in the Western world who have thought about our topic have accepted some form of this classical foundationalistic frame on the conversation. The evidentialist objection to belief in God, furthermore, is obviously rooted in this way of looking at things. So suppose we try to achieve a deeper understanding of it. So this is what his whole paper is going to be about, rejecting this, but he's a really impressive thinker and writer. So let's just look at it closer and analyze it first. All right. Earlier, I said, the first thing to see about the evidentialist objection is that it is a normative contention or claim, right? You're not behaving properly if you go around believing things without good evidence, right? That's the claim. The claim is tisk tisk, shame on you. The same thing must be said about foundationalism. This thesis is a normative thesis. Interesting. A thesis about how a system of beliefs ought to be structured. A thesis about the properties of a correct or acceptable or rightly constructed system of beliefs. According to the foundationalist, oh, this is interesting. I hadn't thought of this before. We had said that Quine was providing an alternative framework model. Nietzsche, the alternate, right? So we've got these existentialists and we've got these let's wait for Tartaglia to answer the question of what a proper title would be for them that he would pick. But these post-logical positivists of that other thread and trend, both giving alternative views to this foundationalism stuff. Nietzsche famously in an allegorical or poetic form said, look, imagine you built a whole castle on solid ground and it completely collapsed. And so you built another one and it completely collapsed. And you built another one, it completely collapsed. And this happened 12 times. And while you read this, you're just thinking, Leibniz, Mellenbrunch, Spinoza, Locke. Right? It's just like, okay, I get what you're talking about, buddy. It says, what if we got sick of this and we built a strong ship instead that could just sail out in stormy seas and not be toppled? Is there another way of being integral? And so poetically, he's talking about an alternative way of looking at foundationalism or the proper justification of beliefs in their relationship to one another. So both Quine, as the one alternative, and this existentialist and pragmatist and phenomenologist stuff, they're both sort of making a break from this thing that's still probably the most popular and has been the most popular. I'm not saying it's wrong, by the way, either. The most popular way of Western thinking about the proper way to, you've got to ground everything on stuff that's properly basic and build up from there with proper logical forms. Okay. The same thing must be said about foundationalism. This thesis is a normative thesis, a thesis about how a system of beliefs ought to be structured, a thesis about the properties of a correct or acceptable or rightly structured system of beliefs. According to the foundationalist, there are norms or duties or obligations with respect to belief, just as there are with respect to actions. To conform to these duties and obligations is to be rational. That's his whole question. Is it rational to believe in God? Well, these people think it's not rational to do anything that isn't in a system of beliefs that's foundational. To fail to measure up to them is to be irrational. To be rational, then, is to exercise one's epistemic powers properly, to exercise them in such a way as to go contrary to none of the norms for such an exercise. I think we can understand foundationalism more fully if we introduce the idea of a noetic structure. A person's noetic structure is the set of propositions he believes, together with certain epistemic relations that hold among him and those propositions. As we have seen, some of my beliefs may be based upon others. It may be that there are a pair of propositions, A and B, such that I believe B and believe A on the basis of B. An account of a person's noetic structure, then, would specify which of his beliefs are basic and which non-basic. Of course, it is abstractly possible that none of his beliefs is basic. Perhaps he holds just three beliefs, A, B, and C, and believes each of them on the basis of the other two. I'm looking to any of those who were there in the recorded last year classes where we talked about the Trinity at the base of being, and time, space, and matter, and the meaninglessness of any two without the third. But anyway, and believes in any of them based on the other two. We might think this improper or irrational, but that is not to say that it could not be done. And it is also possible that all of his beliefs are basic. Perhaps he believes a lot of propositions, but does not believe any of them on the basis of any others. In the typical case, however, a noetic structure will include both basic and non-basic beliefs. It may be useful to give some examples of beliefs that are often basic for a person. Suppose I seem to see a tree. I seem to see a tree. I may then believe the proposition that I see a tree. It is possible that I believe that proposition on the basis of the proposition that I seem to see a tree. In the typical case, however, I will not believe the former on the basis of the latter, because in the typical case, I will not believe the latter at all. I will not be paying any attention to my experience, but will be concentrating on the tree. Of course, I can turn my attention to my experience, notice how things look to me, and acquire the belief that I seem to see something that looks like that. And if you challenge my claim that I see a tree, perhaps I will thus turn my attention to my experience. But in the typical case, I will not believe that I see a tree on the basis of the proposition about my experience, for I believe A on the basis of B only if I believe B. And I don't believe B because I'm not even thinking B, I'm just seeing a tree. And in the typical case where I perceive a tree, I do not believe or entertain any propositions about my experience. Typically, I take such a proposition as basic. Similarly, I believe I had breakfast this morning. This too is basic for me. I do not believe this proposition on the basis of some proposition about my experience, for example, that I seem to remember having had breakfast. In the typical case, I will not have even considered that question. The question whether I seem to remember having had breakfast, instead, I simply believe that I had breakfast. I just believe it. I just remember it without noticing that I'm remembering it. I take it as basic. All right. So far, he said you could have all basic beliefs. You could have all beliefs that are based on each other with nothing being basic, but most people have both. And we're looking at one of them. Okay, second, an account of a noetic structure will include what we might call an index of degree of belief. I hold that some of my beliefs much more firmly than others. I believe both that 2 plus 1 equals 3 and that London, England is north of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. But I believe the former more resolutely than the latter. Some beliefs I hold with maximum firmness, others I do in fact accept, but in a much more tentative way. Third, a somewhat vaguer notion. An account of S's noetic structure would include something like an index of depth of ingression. Some of my beliefs are, we might say, on the periphery of my noetic structure. I accept them and may even accept them firmly. But I could give them up without much change elsewhere in my noetic structure. I believe there are some large boulders on the top of the Grand Teton. If I come to give up this belief, say by climbing it and not finding any, that change need not have extensive reverberations throughout the rest of my noetic structure. It could be accommodated with minimal alteration elsewhere. So its depth of ingression into my noetic structure is not great. On the other hand, if I were to come to believe that there simply is no such thing as Grand Teton, or no mountains at all, or no such thing as the state of Wyoming, that would have much greater reverberations. And suppose I were to come to think there had not been much of a past, that the world was created just 5 minutes ago, complete with all its apparent memories and traces of the past, or that there were not any other persons. These changes would have even greater reverberations. These beliefs of mine have great depth of ingression into my noetic structure. Right? I believe that there are other people. I have good reason. I mean, he's not going to discuss that right now. he just says that belief, whether I have good reason for it or not, is really tied to a whole bunch of the rest of my beliefs. 99% of the rest of my beliefs would be shaken up to some degree or other by having to give that one up. But some, like I had breakfast this morning. That could be basic. I could be justifying it with evidence. I could say I'm a creature of habit and I've been having breakfast every morning for a long time and whatever. I could have arguments for it. I could consider it basic. It doesn't matter. But if I'm wrong about it and you go, actually, you were in the hospital and you've been in a coma all morning. You had a horrible accident on your way to breakfast. And so maybe you dreamt that you had breakfast or you just assumed you had breakfast because that's what you usually do. But you didn't have breakfast this morning. Sorry, buddy. I'd be like, oh, okay. The whole coma thing, that has a lot of reverberations, but the simple giving up the idea that I had breakfast thing doesn't really change a lot of the rest of my beliefs. That part alone is all we're considering. Okay. Where do we leave off? Now, foundationalism is best construed, I think, as a thesis about rational noetic structures. Okay, so he's described these noetic structures, could have basicness to them, might not. They could be a network or a lattice work. They could all be basic and it's all grounding and self-evident, and there is nothing that you have to argue to. It could be a mixture of both of them. But classical foundationalism is a normative claim that a proper network of your beliefs would look like this. It would have properly basic things at the foundation, and it would use proper logical structures to get you to conclusions about others. That's the claim of classical foundationalism, says Plantinga. That's how it should be structured. Should be, ought to be, right? To be completely rational, as I am here using the term, is not to believe only what is true, or to believe all the logical consequences of what one believes, or to believe all necessary truths with equal firmness, or to be uninfluenced by emotion in forming belief. It is instead to do the right thing with respect to one's beliefs. It is to violate no epistemic duties. From this point of view, a rational person is one whose believings meet the appropriate standards. To criticize a person as irrational is to criticize her for failing to fulfill these duties or responsibilities, for failing to conform to the relevant norms or standards. To draw an ethical analogy, the irrational is the impermissible. The rational is the permissible. A rational noetic structure, then, is one that could be the noetic structure of a wholly rational person. And foundationalism, as I say, is a thesis about such noetic structures. We may think of the foundationalist as beginning with the observation that some of our beliefs are based on others, upon others. According to the foundationalist, a rational noetic structure will have a foundation, a set of beliefs not accepted on the basis of others. In a rational noetic structure, some beliefs will be basic. Non-basic beliefs, of course, will be accepted on the basis of other beliefs, which may be accepted on the basis of still other beliefs, and so on until the foundations are reached. In a rational noetic structure, therefore, every non-basic belief is ultimately accepted on the basis of basic beliefs. We're going to stop soon. According to the foundationalists, therefore, every rational noetic structure has a foundation, and all non-basic beliefs are ultimately accepted on the basis of beliefs in the foundations. But a belief cannot properly be accepted on the basis of just any other belief. In a rational noetic structure, A will be accepted on the basis of B only if B supports A, or is a member of a set of beliefs that together support A. It is not clear just what this relation, call it the supports relation, is. Well, for Aristotle's quote earlier, it's pretty clear, right? But let's keep going. What this support relation is, and different foundationalists propose different candidates. Presumably, however, it lies in the neighborhood of evidence. If A supports B, then A is evidence for B, or makes B evident. Or, look at how the language works, right? Or makes B evident, evinces it. Or perhaps B is likely or probable with respect Or perhaps B is likely or probable with respect to B. I think he meant A is likely or probable with respect to B. This relation admits of degrees. My belief that Fike can swim is supported by my knowledge that 9 out of 10 Frisians can swim, and Fike is a Frisian. It is supported more strongly by my knowledge that the evening paper contains a picture of Frike triumphantly finishing first in the 1500-meter freestyle in the 1980 Summer Olympics. And the foundationalist holds, sensibly enough, that in a rational noetic structure, the strength of a non-basic belief will depend upon the degree of support from foundational beliefs. By way of summary, then, let us say that according to foundationalism, 1, in a rational noetic structure, the believed on the basis of relation is asymmetric and irreflexive. 2, a rational noetic structure has a foundation. And 3, in a rational noetic structure, non-basic belief is proportional in strength to support from the foundations. I think that section gets us right up to where he's going to start making his argument, because the next thing he considers in this Aquinas section is the conditions on proper basicality. Okay, he's not saying he's a foundationalist. I think he's probably not, maybe, or maybe he is, but he's looked at foundationalism in order to notice that there's this element of basicness that's inherent in it, that you have to have that. And that was one of the 3 threats. Remember, he looked at the evidentialist objection to belief in God as you haven't provided us enough evidence. And he said, now, wait a minute. That argument, he really looked at it quite carefully. And he said, this is referring to also a category of beliefs that could be properly basic, and that it's not proper to incorporate another idea in with those other ideas. But what if the belief in God was just one of those basic ideas? So he noticed that was left open there. And then the second thing he's done is, by analyzing classical foundationalism, he says, well, this view includes this same category of basicness. So we're going to stop there. I think we've been going a while. This is a very long essay, and we're going to give it its proper attention. So we're not going to rush anything. We haven't gotten through part 2 yet. We spent 2 times on part 1, so we'll spend 2 on part 2. But when we start next, he's going to start looking at the conditions of proper basicality. All right. What do these other ways of thinking require of a belief for it to be properly basic? All right. So as he's going through this examination, he's going to hit on the idea like, hold on a second. The idea that God exists fits perfectly, or I don't know where he's going to go, but we know that his ultimate aim is to argue that belief in God, in the proposition of God, not in the relational sense, which he acknowledges is important and another thing, but the simple philosophical question of, is there a God? Do you accept the proposition God exists? Is the type of thing that is properly basic. And he hasn't gotten there yet. He's just showing us the train of thought, which is quite an impressive train of thought, quite frankly, in a number of ways. And in our after show last time, we talked about a couple of those ways, which we mentioned briefly earlier today. We will stop the recording and go into the after conversation with the 3 of us now, and we will talk about some more of those. We're not going to rush this. We're going to take our time with this. Well, we won't even give that away. We're going to take our time with Plantinga because it's worthwhile, and we're going to continue next time at the same time on Friday. Tomorrow morning, we continue with our second Shakespeare class. We're just reading King Lear now. We finished Hamlet. So this is it's like our 7th or something, but it's the second work of his. And then we're going to do the only 3rd year class that we're doing on Saturdays, which is our Nietzsche context deep dive into Jordan Peterson. And that will happen at 11 a.m. on Eastern Standard Time as usual. So I'll see y'all there tomorrow. And let's go into the after show.